morning. We welcome today's meeting of the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Members of the public may like to follow us on @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag AssemblyFire for the meeting. Please may I remind everybody to turn off your phones or put them on silent. On the agenda today is a session on building safety and cladding with the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development and a discussion with the London Fire Brigade on inclusion within the Brigade. However, we've just got some short items of business first. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member Moema will substitute today.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any other disclosable pecuniary interest in any specific items listed on the agenda? No. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 8th of July 2021?
Confirmed.
Thank you. Can we note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Lovely. So that brings us to our main item of business, our first session in a discussion on building safety and cladding. So can I welcome our guests for this first session? Tom Coakley, Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development. Good to see you back with us again, Tom.
To see you all.
And Paul Jennings, nice to see you again, who is the Assistant Commissioner for the London Fire Brigade. So with that, we will start our questioning, gentlemen, and I'll start as is normal. So, Tom, how many London buildings over 18 metres tall currently still have dangerous ACM cladding?
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. You all seem very far away. I still can't get quite up used to this new setup. But, so in answer to your question, Chair, as you all know, as members will know, the government publishes monthly updates on building safety. And as at the 31st of August, there were 54 buildings in London that still have ACM cladding installed. And I think all of us here would agree that more than 4 years after the Grenfell Tower fire, it's pretty disgraceful and unacceptable that that is still the case. It shouldn't have taken a year for the government to set up the Social Sector Cladding Remediation Fund and a further year after that to set up the Private Sector Cladding Remediation Fund and then a further year after that to set up the Building Safety Fund. There is a great need for this problem to be resolved. And we, through our building safety funds, are working with the government to do what we can to resolve this problem and ensure that these buildings are remediated as quickly as possible, along, of course, with other buildings with dangerous cladding through the Building Safety Fund.
Okay, good. We're really here to find out what you're doing to help with this, Tom. So why do you think London's progress in remediation of buildings with ACM cladding is behind the rest of the country?
I think there are a number of reasons why progress has been slightly slower in London, although it's worth noting that progress is ongoing and has been accelerating. I mean, you just have to look at this. I have the benefit here of being able to see the view outside. The urban fabric of London is very, very different from the rest of the country. And although the buildings that we can see there are mainly office rather than residential, it does paint a picture of the situation in London, which is vastly different from the rest of the country. It's also worth noting that London has more high-rise residential buildings than the rest of the country put together. And these are often very large, very complex buildings that require, with difficult access issues as well, because of the very built-up nature of London. These are very complex buildings that take time to remediate. I would also point out as well that we have received into our private sector cladding remediation fund in London more late buildings than Homes England have received in the rest of the country. And of course that means that those buildings obviously are starting later than the other buildings that were originally within the Building Safety Fund. within the social sector cladding remediation under the private sector.
Can I be really annoying, as you're used to me being anyway? Can you move your Surface Pro, because it's right in front of your microphone? I wouldn't want anybody not to be able to hear you, Tom.
Well, I hope you didn't miss any of that. I'm happy to repeat anything if it wasn't clear.
Okay, that's lovely. You mentioned the view. Make the most of it, Tom, because soon when we move to the Crystal, we will be looking at water.
There is a beautiful view over the Royal Docks. I can.
There's a cement factory.
I can assure you.
None of us can wait for that, can we, colleagues? Sure. So what progress has been made by the Mayor's building safety team to accelerate removal of dangerous cladding from London's high-rise residential buildings?
I mean, so our officers in the building safety team work very, very closely with building owners, with responsible entities in order to accelerate the pace of delivery. So they're in very close contact with building owners. They also work with officers at MHCLG in order to try and ensure that things move quickly. Sorry, it's not MHCLG anymore, is it? LUC, Levelling Up Housing and Communities. I won't be able to get used to that for a little while, so I might just continue to call it MHCLG for now. Works closely with MHCLG officials to try and improve the design of these programs, and that's particularly important as the building safety program, as you know, is being expanded. And it's particularly important that we learn from the existing programme. And then, of course, myself and the Mayor are also putting pressure on building owners as well. As you know, the Mayor wrote to some 40 building owners, both social sector and private sector, in September last year, urging them to give them a kick, really, urging them to accelerate the pace of remediation. And I have met, along with the Minister Lord Stephen Greenhalgh, with a number of building owners to put pressure where they are, where remediation has been slow, in order to put pressure on them to accelerate their pace of remediation.
When you wrote to the landlord, what sort of response did you get from them?
So in terms of, well, the response has been really, I think, in terms of the sort of acceleration of remediation. So the letters, the sort of 40 letters to the building owners covered about 51 buildings. And since then, we've seen on the private sector side, 34 of those buildings have now started on site. On the social sector side, and bearing in mind there were many fewer social sector landlords that hadn't commenced remediation yet, 7 have started on site and 3 have now completed. So, you know, we have seen the effect of putting a bit more of a rocket under these building owners who weren't, who weren't getting on with the job. I should say it's a very complicated picture, much more so, of course, on the private sector side than the social sector side, because you're often dealing with complex ownership structures and owners who, quite frankly, you know, freeholders who just aren't interested, and you know, responsible and managing agents, the responsible entities, who simply aren't used to doing major capital projects in the way that, you know, your large housing associations are, for example. So it has been much more difficult on the private sector side than the social sector side. But of course, there are still some social sector landlords that haven't quite got there yet in terms of remediating all their buildings, and we continue to work closely with them as well.
It does show that if the Mayor does get involved, I know you'd like to blame the government, and there's politics in there, but you blame the government, but when the Mayor has sent a sharp letter, it is beginning to at least make people start doing something which alleviates some of these terrible worries these poor owners of these properties or renters have. So I'm glad he's done something that is beginning to make a difference there. If I can go to Paul, what is the latest figure for high-rise residential buildings in London that have simultaneous evacuation agreements suspended, so requiring LFB checks fortnightly? Where are
Chair, and good morning, panel. The latest figures that we produce on a monthly basis on the 15th of the month stand at this month at 1,053. That's an increase of in the region of 40 to 50 buildings that have got simultaneous evacuation strategy, across those buildings. Now, within that figure, a proportion will be Waking Watch. There'll also be a proportion that have got a common alarm fitted, and that's where we're seeing the Waking Watch Relief Fund being used to fit that alarm. And there'll also be a combination of a common alarm and an evacuation management system. So there's roughly around a third of each within that total figure.
Okay. If people apply through the fund for the common alarm system and are refused, what is generally the reason for refusal?
I'd have to defer to Tom.
It's often because the buildings do not meet the requirements of the programme. So, for example, the Waking Watch Release Fund, you still have to be a building over 18 metres in height. So if someone applies, if a building owner applies and it turns out that their building is less than 18 metres, then we would have to say no, or MHCLG, LUHC would have to say, no, I'm sorry, you're not eligible for the programme. So it's instances like that.
Okay, fine, thank you. I'll pass over to my colleague, Nick.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, just a couple of questions on the Waking Watch Relief Fund. Could you just give us an update on what progress is being made with applications and when you expect the funds to be released?
Yes, absolutely. So we received 111 applications, which I believe is more than the rest of the country put together, which demonstrates the scale of the issue in London. So 109 of those have been referred to the Levelling Up Department for a decision, and we've paid out, I believe, just under £378,000 of funding has been paid so far out of those funds. So and again, just as with the cladding remediation funds, working very closely with the building owners.
So 111 applications, and I think that, I'm looking at statistics here, that covers 159 buildings? Is that...
It may well cover 159 buildings because some of the applications do cover multiple buildings. Okay. Yes.
And again, in our notes it says that the Waking Watch 675 buildings with cladding issues have a Waking Watch. So I just wonder, what do you think is the, and yet we only had 159 buildings covered by application. Sure. So what's the disparity there? Is it that they're lower buildings that don't meet the criteria, or?
Yes, it will almost certainly, I think, in most cases be the fact that a lot of those buildings that have a Waking Watch will not meet the thresholds or the other requirements of the programme. It may also be, of course, that they're very close to being fully remediated, and therefore, you know, by the time an alarm was installed, the cladding would already have been replaced, and the buildings would be safe. So that may also be an issue as well. It's worth pointing out that there was some funding nationally and in London, I believe, left over, and the funds have now reopened as well. So if there are still building owners who were eligible but who did not apply for whatever reason the first time around, the funds have now reopened. But there was, unfortunately, you know, I think unfortunately the height threshold still remains at 18 metres. They've not dropped the threshold.
And the approved funding so far looks to be just over 50% of the total available funds. So, I mean, if would there be any possibility of widening the eligibility criteria if there's an underspend in the funds, or would that be a discussion you have to have with the department?
It's all with the department. So the department sets the criteria. We of course do what we can to feed in, and as I say, my view would be that if there is funding left over, that we should look at broadening it out to buildings under 18 metres, and particularly buildings under 18 metres that might not be due to be remediated for some time. So in order that people aren't going to be paying these costs for a very long time. I mean, it's worth pointing out as well, of course, I mean, the Mayor's been very clear that in his view the government should be covering the costs of Waking Watch itself, so that this burden doesn't fall on leaseholders. But of course we do welcome any additional funding, for example through the Waking Watch Relief Fund, that can provide some respite.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Clark.
Sorry, I'm coming in on the back of F.
Sorry,
I'm coming in on the back of F. Do you want me to take this one as well, Chair?
if you want to, if not, you have got G, which is the next question.
Yeah. Sorry. Tom, the committee recommended that the Mayor press the government to extend the Waking Watch Relief Fund to cover the costs of all temporary fire safety measures required in high-rise, high-risk buildings until the fire defects are fixed. Have the government agreed to the costs?
No, unfortunately, the government have not agreed to cover the cost of Waking Watch, which is, I think it's very unfortunate. I mean, you've got people who not only are they trapped in these unsafe buildings, probably can't sell. Their insurance premiums might have gone up through the roof. They face, all of the sort of mental health costs of that, and they're having to pay for these interim measures. So I don't think it's fair that these costs fall upon leaseholders.
Okay, thank you. And then Tom, back to you. How is the Mayor working with the London Fire Brigade to assess the impact on the Brigade of new legislation?
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I'm
Yeah.
really sorry. Can you lean nearer to your microphone so you're a little
I'm
bit
sorry.
louder?
Can you hear me now? I think is the microphone.
That's better.
Is that better?
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Tom, how is the Mayor working with the LFB to assess the impact on the Brigade of new legislation?
Yes, sure. So we've worked closely together, for example, in the aftermath of the New Providence Wharf fire. We worked very closely together in the aftermath of that. We recently jointly met with leaseholders to discuss the issue of the cost of Waking Watch, and whether there's anything else that can be done in order to alleviate the sort of burden falling on leaseholders. I mean, I might pass over Paul to sort of talk more about, specifically, what LFB's sort of thinking is in relation to the new legislation that's coming forward in the Building Safety Bill.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the question. One of the main thrusts of the new legislation is the introduction of the Building Safety Regulator, which will sit under the Health and Safety Executive. And we're looking and working with government to determine what that operating model will look like, because there will be a commitment from all the fire and rescue services around the country to support that. And we're not quite clear yet on what that model will look like. So that will have an impact in terms of resources and costs. So it's still yet to be decided, but we're looking at that and working with that and factoring that into what increase in costs that will be for my team in terms of protection officers.
Really helpful. And Tom, just quickly, can you outline the Mayor's view of the bill and what amendments are required to protect leaseholders?
Thank you, Wes. Well, I mean, the Mayor welcomes the bill, and certainly the principle of the bill, and much of what is in there, including the new building safety regulation regime that will come with it. I think the key issue that the Mayor has in terms of an omission from the bill is that protection for leaseholders from costs. And, throughout the passage of the Fire Safety Bill, now the Fire Safety Act, a number of attempts were made, on a cross-party basis. In fact, the amendments came from the government's own backbenchers to try and put into legislation protection for leaseholders to stop costs from falling on them. And I think on at least 5 occasions it went, amendments were put in the House of Lords, came back to the House of Commons and were removed. And in the end, as is always the case, the government got its way. But throughout that, the government did say this is not the time to bring in, this is not the legislation in which to bring in these protections. Let's wait for the Building Safety Bill. And of course, we wait with bated breath for the publication of the Building Safety Bill, and it doesn't include these protections for leaseholders. And I hope, I think there's a great opportunity here with the new Secretary of State, Michael Gove, who, politics aside, whatever, is clearly a big hitter, as they say, and clearly has been brought in by the Prime Minister to try and sort this issue out. And I do wish him, the very best with it, because it's such an important issue and it needs resolving. And I think there is definitely an opportunity for him here to make his sort of mark on this by introducing his own amendments to the bill to put in place those protections for leaseholders. Because without that, it's no good it's no good the government just saying, well, leaseholders shouldn't bear the cost. I mean, you're the government. You can do something about it. And really the best thing would have been for the government to have, right at the start, fronted up the cost, and then we could have argued about, who else pays later, whether it's the building owner or the construction company or whatever. But it certainly shouldn't have been the leaseholders. It should never have been the leaseholders. And so, I would urge Michael Gove, please amend the bill, amend your own bill, and bring in those protections for leaseholders.
Okay, and thank you. Final question. And Tom, I'm particularly worried about residents in my own constituency, actually, both in Camden and Barnet. I can think of examples of these blocks between 11 and 18 metres. The government is developing a long-term low-interest loan scheme in which, quote, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month. Will paying £600 a year in loans going to be affordable for low-paid Londoners?
No, I certainly don't think it's affordable for a great many Londoners, but also regardless of affordability, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair that just because you live in a building that is lower than 18 metres, you should have to pay this cost, whereas if you're happen to be in a building over 18 metres, your costs are covered by the funds. I just don't think it's fair. I also think there's going to be some real practical issues with this as well. I don't see how you can bring something in with this if it is attached to the property itself, that it won't then have an impact on the value of the property. And if it's attached to the person in the property and it just follows the person when they move, that seems very unfair as well. Why is it that the person who happened to be in the property at the time faces that cost and then has to take it with them? And I don't think this hasn't been worked out yet, I don't think, by the government. They've announced the scheme. They haven't come up yet with how it would work. But I don't think it's a very just way of solving the issue. I think it creates a leaseholder lottery. And the best thing would be for the government to say, regardless of height and regardless of the nature of the building safety defect, people's costs will be covered by the fund. We'll bring in developer levy, and we'll make sure that as much is claimed back as possible from the people who built these buildings originally.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I bring in Assembly Member Prince, I think Assembly Member Bakari would like to just ask a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Just linked to the new legislation, and we've talked about this before, about encouraging better practice. Has the City Hall and London Fire Brigade looked at the awareness campaign that we've talked about the unlimited fines that you can place on responsible persons who do not complete or follow up on actions on the fire risk assessments?
Is this? I'm not sure. It's from. Is this something LFB have looked at?
We're looking at all the intricacies of the bill and working with the government and the NFCC to identify all of the elements of that. And at the moment, we've got to work through them. So it's early days yet.
Would you be interested in doing some sort of awareness campaign, though?
I think we've got to do an awareness campaign because there's lots of misinformation out there around fire risk assessments, whose responsibility it is. It's a very complex area, and we've mentioned about freeholders and building owners, but where we get shared ownership and where we get residents management companies, that responsibility falls on residents themselves, and we're seeing that complexity play out. So the more information and awareness that we can create can only make things better in this complex environment.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Good morning, Tom. What progress has been made by the Mayor, London councils and the LFB to assess the number of high-rise residential buildings with safety defects in London?
So I think Paul has probably got the most comprehensive figures on this. Obviously, this is an exercise that's being conducted by councils. They originally asked to look at buildings over 18 metres, and now I believe they're looking at buildings between 11 and 18 metres. The GLA itself doesn't hold this information. This is an exercise that is between luck and London and councils, not just in London, but across the country. But it might be that Paul has, from the LFB side, some more comprehensive data.
So the government set us the task of carrying out the building risk review last year. They anticipated that we would have in the region of 8,005 high-rise residential buildings in London. On further examination, we have inspected 8,400. Of those, the crews have now created what we call an electronic information on, that's available on all the mobile data systems. So we're much more aware of where these buildings are and what the priority is in terms of risk of all those buildings. And depending on the risk scoring that was carried out will depend on whether fire safety audits were carried out on those buildings. We've completed that process now for all those buildings over 18 metres. We're now carrying out a period of quality assurance around all of those visits and inspections, and all of that will be complete by the deadline on the 31st of this year.
What would you say the number was then?
So it's 8,400 that we've inspected in London.
Right.
So
Does that mean that the final number could be greater?
More than was anticipated, and that equates to a national figure that was anticipated in the region of 12,000. So you see the extent that London owns or has in its responsibility.
That's good for me, thank you.
Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. This is for Tom. The GLA is supposed to be supporting people going through the application process for the Waking Watch Relief Fund. How's that going? And do you think that people who have received the right level of support, what is the process for those who have been declined support through this scheme?
So I think we need to be clear who we're talking about when we're talking about supporting people here. So the relationship that the GLA has, the application is made by the building owner, and the relationship that the GLA has is with, the responsible entity, and the relationship the GLA has is with the responsible entity, and it's the responsibility of the responsible entity then to communicate properly with leaseholders, people living in their buildings. So that's how the relationships work here with all of the funds that we've got.
So there have been some applicants who still haven't heard back. Given it's been 5 months since those applications have closed, can you provide some kind of update on why this is still happening?
I'd be very surprised if there are applicants that haven't heard back after that time. I mean, as I say, we've received 111 and 109 have been referred to MHCLG for a decision. I would suggest that if there are any applicants that have contacted you that have not heard back from us yet, that you write to me and I will pick this up with the team. I don't think it's something I can pick up in a public forum, particularly because we don't discuss the identity of buildings or applicants. But I'd certainly
but you'll be happy to look into this.
Very happy to look into it. Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, there are some buildings that have also got an issue with waking watches where they've been fitted, where there's also a common alarm system. Are you aware of how many buildings in London have a common fire alarm system but are still requiring this waking watch?
I don't have those figures off the top of my head. No, I'm afraid not, Assembly Member Bakari.
Yeah, there's been some concern from leaseholder groups that there are waking watches that might actually not necessarily be needed in some buildings, and this is a major issue, especially as it costs so much. So have you both considered maybe producing some sort of list of approved waking watch providers for London?
I think that might need to be one for Paul rather than me.
This fits with the responsible person and the fact that they employ a fire risk assessor. So unfortunately, we couldn't, as the enforcing authority, it would be a conflict of interest for us to provide a list of providers in that space. So although we can advise residents, we can speak to them about the fire risk assessment, we can't get involved in that. And in these cases with leaseholder groups, we're doing lots of those communication sessions wherever we can, just to raise that awareness.
Okay, thank you. It's really important that we do raise this, though, even though the complexity of it all, considering how much the leaseholders have been telling us about the problems of this area. How is the Mayor supporting Londoners affected by the cladding crisis, and what more needs to be done? I know you've touched on this already, but if there's anything more you can add.
Absolutely. So the mayor, obviously the mayor's powers and resources in this area are limited, but he's doing what he can, particularly through his lobbying and advocacy channels, to advocate on behalf of leaseholders, and he's going to continue to do so. As I'm sure you know, Assembly Member Bakari, because you were there, the mayor was at the Leaseholders Together rally last week, organised by the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, using the platform, to stress, the point again that it should not be leaseholders that bear the costs of remediating mistakes that they had no part in calling. And of course he was also supporting amendments to the Building Safety Bill to that effect. He's called repeatedly for the government and for the building safety, for the building industry to cover the cost of both cladding and non-cladding remediation works, and for the height threshold to be removed, and essentially for all buildings to be eligible for funding. He's been advocating for transparency about how landlords are communicating with residents, and also last week wrote to social landlords and our private landlords as well, and calling on them to make sure they're sharing fire safety information, particularly FRAs, with their residents, because as we know, some do and some don't. The Building Safety Bill will make that mandatory for residents and prospective residents, but in the meantime, I think it's very important that these building owners do that voluntarily. He set up an EWS1 task and finish group, which is currently in process, which is looking at how we can improve the experience of leaseholders who are required to get an EWS1 form. We surveyed some of our partners, and frankly, their performance on this was pretty mixed, and that's where this EWS1 form task and finish group has come from. And he's also, of course, finally pushed very strongly, and he did in December last year for.
You've told me lots of things that he's done, but what more needs to be done? What's
not
happening?
as far as I can see, I mean, as I say, the FRA letter went just last week. I'm always very open to looking at anything additionally that we can do here.
Working
but
with
I do feel
that are still involved with the fire safety scandal that are.
Sorry.
How about the fact that he's still working with developers that are, basically continuing this crisis?
When you say working with developers that are continuing this crisis, I mean, this is a systemic crisis. It has been 40 years, essentially, of failure, of which a huge amount of that failure falls on successive governments. The issue here is that the government is not making sufficient funding available in order for these buildings to be remediated. And a lot of the cladding that requires to be remediated was cladding that successive governments said was safe to be put onto buildings, which is, a scandal in and of itself. That it was deemed that combustible, flammable plastic should be put on buildings. It's a systemic crisis that requires a comprehensive national solution, and that is what the Mayor has been pushing for.
Okay, I'll move on because I know that we're not going to agree completely on that area. There are many examples of leaseholders in London that have been exploited by fraudsters. They have been issuing fake EWS1 forms. It's been reported in the Inside Housing recently of the prevalence of unregistered fire risk assessors being used by housing providers in London. How are you and the Mayor working with the London Fire Brigade and others to combat this in our city?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that there have been a number of cases of this. It's fraud, essentially, where the Mayor has been made aware of this in the past. I believe it was raised with him during an interview on LBC. I believe he referred the matter to the police. And, if you are aware of any specific cases of this happening, I think it does have to become a matter for the police, because these are fraudsters.
And how are you and the Mayor working to use all communication channels available to promote and share all of those approved list of fire risk assessors? I know that you said it's complex, but can you just tell me a little bit more about how you're sharing that information with leaseholders and landlords across London, just to avoid scams?
On our website, we've got a whole host of information, not only for responsible persons, but leaseholders, residents of high-rise blocks, a wealth of information there to guide them into what they should be doing, how they can make the right checks to determine that they've got the right competent fire safety professionals.
Thank you. I appreciate giving me all those answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Bukhari.
Just Sahota, did you still want to come in, or has it been answered?
I'd like to just ask one more question on the funding, please. Funding for Cladding, Tom. just want to find out that the government have so far announced £5 billion funding for cladding removal, but a common select committee has suggested a figure of 15 billion. Is the government providing enough funding to make London's buildings safe?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think one of the extraordinary things about the building safety crisis, of course, is that actually we really don't know what the final bill could be for it. I mean, the £15 billion figure has been mentioned a number of times. The government have made £4.5 billion available, although in a very sort of piecemeal fashion, it has to be said. It's not conducive to having a sort of a structured and organised approach to dealing with the problem. I mean, as I said, the Mayor's view is that the cost should have been borne by the government at the beginning. The government has the shoulders with which to bear these costs and could then argue with construction companies and building owners later on in order to try and claw back as much as possible. That would also have sped up the pace of remediation as well, rather than waiting for funds to be set up, being told that level of funding was this and no more, and then due to, in no small part, in fact due mostly to the tenacity of campaigners like UCAG and End Our Cladding scandal, being then pushed into providing more funding. It would have been much better for there to have been a much more sort of central and structured approach from the beginning that started from the principle that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay.
And of course, this 15 billion figure is related to buildings which are tall buildings, which are over 18 metres. That, of course, doesn't count the cost for making these low-rise buildings safe. Has the Mayor made any estimation of what the cost would be of making every single building in London safe?
We don't have an estimation of that in London, partly because we still don't know the full picture of how many buildings below 18 metres with dangerous cladding there are. So it would be very difficult to make an estimation on that basis. But I think the principle remains: why is it you can be in a building that's 17 metres and not be covered by the funds and have to pay, and you can be in a building that's 19 metres and everything is covered? It doesn't seem very fair to those people in lower rise buildings.
And just finally, in response to our March 2021 report on cladding recommendations, the Mayor said local authorities already have systems and expertise in place that could support a more extensive audit, and as such they are best placed to lead any further work in this area. The Mayor will support them by continuing to make the case to central government for comprehensive funding, as data collection is dependent upon adequate resourcing. Is the government providing the resources necessary to complete this audit in London?
I think, the local authorities have been tasked and resourced to identify buildings over 18 metres. I believe now they're also doing between 11 and 18 metres. I think local authorities, have been under-resourced for some time, and any additional resources that could be made available for this kind of work would be greatly welcomed.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And the last two questions to Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you and good morning both. My question's for you, Tom. First of all, I'd like to associate myself with your comments that the last people who should be bearing the brunt of this is the leaseholders. When do you think London's leaseholders will be free of the blight of fire safety defects within their buildings?
Unfortunately, I think it is very difficult to say, and I think that if you're talking about the last people to be freed from this terrible burden, we could be talking potentially a decade from now. I mean, this is the gravity of the situation, and again, why it shouldn't have taken so long for these various funds to have been established in the first place, and why there is a pressing need to speed up remediation. And I repeat what I said earlier. I genuinely hope that Michael Gove being brought in to take on this brief is a sign that the government wants to give things a bit of a kick and to get this problem sorted out. And it has to be. We can't have people being trapped, in their homes that may be unsellable. with dangerous cladding and going through all sorts of changes in their family circumstances, for example, for a decade. I think it is far more action needs to be taken.
I agree. Assemblymember Bokhari earlier asked a question about the mayor working with developers, and you responded, and it was fair enough. You said this is a systemic crisis, it's successive governments. But I don't feel like you quite answered a question, because there is a role here for the mayor, isn't there, in leadership? And actually he could be boycotting or speaking out against those developers that aren't doing the right thing here. And it's good that he's sharing a platform with End Our Cladding Scandal and he's saying the right things. But isn't it time to take some more definitive action, or at least some soft power, in those developers who aren't meeting their expectations?
So when you're talking about developers here, in terms of the GLA's partnerships, the vast majority of, I think what you're referring to as developers, will be housing associations who are providers of affordable housing and of social housing. There's no doubt that the social housing sector has dropped the ball in many regards, but we still rely on the social housing sector and the housing association sector to deliver the homes that we need for the people that we are all aware of, the people who are living in overcrowded accommodation, in temporary accommodation, people really bearing the brunt of the housing crisis that goes beyond, of course, just the building safety crisis. I don't think that it is right to pit the interests of people living in temporary accommodation, people who are homeless, against the interests of leaseholders. There has to be a solution for both those people, and both of those solutions involves greater funding from the government. It involves greater funding for the cladding remediation funds to ensure that no leaseholder has to bear the cost of this, and it involves much greater funding for our affordable homes programme to ensure that we can adequately fund both our council and housing association partners to deliver at a scale that is needed. And I don't think that, I think you also fall into the issue as well, when you say, developers involved in the building safety crisis. I mean, that's pretty much everyone in the sector. I don't think there is a housing association, certainly a large housing association or a private developer, that you couldn't point to and say are in some way implicated at some point during the building safety crisis, because it's a systemic crisis. The government are also implicated in this as well, because it was the government that said you can put these materials on buildings in the first place. That's on the government. If there are subsequently, where they take the cladding off and they find that there's things like fire breaks missing, that's definitely on the developer, whether they're a charitable developer or a private developer. And that's why we need a comprehensive approach that involves both the government paying a fair whack and the sector itself paying a fair whack as well. And I think that's fair.
Yes, we absolutely need a comprehensive approach. Yes, it's not right to pit two competing groups against each other, and yes, the government have to take the major responsibility for here. I do still think there's something there, though, about when social housing associations have dropped the ball, for there not to be any consequences there. And perhaps if there isn't a good one, a good practice, maybe that's something the mayor could be doing. Finding examples of best practice and championing it.
One thing the mayor is very clear on, and I'm very clear on, is that the regulatory framework for social landlords is not fit for purpose. I hate the term not fit for purpose, so I just used it. But it's inadequate. It's not strong enough. It's not firm enough. And there needs to be a much better framework. By the way, there was a slightly better regulatory framework when the Audit Commission existed, but that was abolished during the bonfire of the Quangos by the coalition government. So yeah, just to point that one out. But the regulatory framework has been stripped away and stripped away and stripped away over the last sort of decade or so, and it has to change.
Finally, I asked this to Deputy Mayor Twycross in July in our meeting, and she said she'd get back to me, but I don't believe she has. Shared ownership. Often the housing associations always won't buy it back. So the people living in shared ownership are expected to pay 100% of the costs, even though they're not going to be remediated for 100% of the building. What action will you take to protect those people in shared ownership?
Well, I think if there's an injustice that people who own 100% of their home leasehold and still have to bear the cost of historic building safety defects that weren't their fault, then there's an even greater injustice that people who might only own a proportion of their home still have to pay the full whack for building safety defects that were not their fault. I think the reality is the solution really is the same, and that is for a comprehensive protection for all leaseholders. And unfortunately, that's not something that the mayor can provide in London. It's something that has to come through legislation. It has to come now through the Building Safety Bill and through amendments to the Building Safety Bill that will achieve that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski's made some very good points there, and it's incumbent upon us all to look after these residents as best we can, politics aside. They've been in a dreadful situation for too long, so everything that the Mayor and I'm sure the government can do, they really must do. So that brings us to the end of this first session today. Can I thank our guests very much for joining us. We're now going to take a very short adjournment to seat our second panel of guests. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back for our second session of today, and we welcome our guests from London Fire Brigade for our discussion on inclusion within the Brigade. So first of all, Andy Rowe, London Fire Commissioner. Where are you there? You've all moved round one. Tim Powell, Director of People at the London Fire Brigade, and Kate Bonham, Assistant Director of People Services from the London Fire Brigade. So can we start our questions, please? Dr. Sahota is going to ask questions.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. The first question is to you, Commissioner. How is the London Fire Brigade encouraging and supporting the recruitment of a diverse workforce?
For a long time now, so since I started in this post, we've had a very focused approach to recruiting from London, really reaching out into communities, so a focused outreach kind of programme. Actually, if I could turn to either Kate or Tim, it may be Kate, as the figures, I think we have demonstratively improved how we recruit. Perhaps you could give some figures, Kate, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So as the Commissioner said, since 2017, really, we re-established our outreach team that had a real focus on doing this. And in that time, if we take the figures from 2019 to 2021, we've improved the proportion of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff from 10% to 33%. Coming into the FFD programme, or Firefighter Development Programme. And for women, it's gone up from 9.8% to 22.8%. And that has resulted in an improvement of our workforce composition for those groups as a result of that.
The Mayor has set the MPS ambitious targets to aim at 16% of his officers to be Black, Asian minority groups by 2022, right? And 21% by 2024. And 28% by 2030. Are there any targets for London Fire Brigade? And if so, what are those targets?
So we have some targets that are set out in our report, but I don't think they're the same as those targets, but we can take that away and have a look for you.
Yeah, I was just comparing with the MPS, right? So if you write to us, okay, what your targets
sure,
are.
we can do that.
And also, the Mayor wanted 40% of new recruits to the MPS to be BME by next year. What's your target for new recruits in the BME group?
So again, we don't have specific targets that are the same as that, but I'll come back to you to confirm how the two compare.
Okay. Have you spoken to Cressida Dick, the Commissioner for Metropolitan Police, to find out what the MPS is doing to make their workforce more diverse? Have you done that, and what lessons can you learn from the MPS?
Perhaps I could speak to that. So I have spoken to Cressida about her recruitment strategy. I know that colleagues in People Services speak to their equivalents in the Met Police, so we can share understanding. Because actually, both Cress and I know from the conversations I've had with colleagues that Met Police are very interested in what we've done because of the scale of increase we've been able to show. Mm-hmm. But yes, I can assure the Assembly member that we are very interested in the approach they're taking, having been set those very ambitious stretch targets. And I think we would aspire to kind of match their effort, because what the police are doing is no less important for the London Fire Brigade.
Okay. And in October 2017, you launched a 4-week recruitment campaign targeting female and BME Londoners. How did that campaign go? And subsequent to that, what targets did you specifically? Have you targeted any group specifically after that?
I think the best answer to that is, rather than focus on what was a discrete piece of recruitment at the time, which some lessons were learnt from, is really to reflect on the answer that Kate gave you in the first instance, which is we now take a continuous approach to community engagement to bring in young Londoners, particularly, who represent the full kind of swathe of communities in London, and that is reflected in the very significant increase in diversity in our intake figures. So rather than doing single blocks of kind of a 4-week recruitment process, we now continuously recruit, because we recognise that's better for our workforce planning, but also for continuously maintaining progress in the context of a diverse workforce.
And the vast majority of your new recruits are males. I mean, if I look at the figures for 2017, there were 143 males and only 53 females. And in 2021, the figures were 111 females and 276 males. What are you doing to make the recruitment much more balanced?
Kate, perhaps you could answer, because you have the detail of the recruitment campaigns.
Yeah, that's fine. So our outreach team take their main focus of their approach is to focus on relationships with the community, and also to understand some of the barriers that some underrepresented groups have. In some ways that can come down to some of the perceptions that some groups might have about the fire brigade. For example, in some of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, we understand that there is some perception about the difference between the LFB as a career and the firefighter career compared to perhaps a doctor or a lawyer. And so we've been working really closely with communities to break down that kind of stigma and perhaps the myths around that. And similarly for women, there is a kind of perception around the role being very, very kind of focused on the actual firefighting. And actually, as we know, it's much more broader than that. And community engagement being a huge part of that, and fire safety. And so the outreach team have been doing a lot of work to kind of help people to understand the variety that comes with that role. And that has had a real benefit. And we have seen, as you can see through the data, a real increase in the proportion of women that have come through.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you. Commissioner and Kate, actually, when you were talking about the improvements you've made, the progress you've made with recruiting a diverse workforce, Kate, you touched on the figures for people from the BAME communities and women who are coming into the fire brigade. You didn't mention LGBT staff. So I guess, Commissioner, for you, do you recognise that in order to have a fully diverse workforce, you need to be recruiting LGBT Londoners? And do you track, in the same way that Kate gave figures for BAME and women, do you track the recruitment of LGBT staff? And if so, what are the figures that you've got?
So the answer to the first part of the question is yes, absolutely. If we truly want to represent London, then we have to draw from all of London's communities. And I would suggest it's even wider than perhaps the groups we've used as examples. You know, if we think about how people approach problem solving, for example, we are one of the biggest neurodivergent employers, I would suggest, in the country by proportion. And we still don't recognise the strengths that neurodiversity brings to the organisation. We have a great number of dyslexic firefighters who actually, through their compensatory mechanisms, for example, just bring us a different set of skills. So we're trying to think as broadly as possible about the kind of balance of skills, experiences and backgrounds we want to bring in. But you're absolutely right. I think that we do need to recruit in a focused way from the LGBT plus community. I'm going to have to turn to my colleague to understand how effectively we track that. I'm not sure we always have done in the past, but perhaps, Kate, if you could provide an answer.
Yeah, that's right. I will admit that we don't track our LGB intake as closely as we do BAME and women. However, we do track the workforce composition. So we do know that we are, for example, for our LGB staff, we have improved recently up from 5.1% of our workforce for the operational side to 5.5%. So we have seen some improvements. However, that doesn't represent London, so there is a lot more we need to do. And I think we have had a lot of focus on women and BAME, given some of the real challenges we've had. But I think we need to widen that.
Do you think it would be a worthwhile thing to start tracking
Absolutely.
recruitment for LGBT in the same way as BAME and women communities? But fine. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
So I'm sorry, Chair, as you know, I missed the pre-meeting. My apologies for that.
You're
So
on
we come to question B now,
B.
is that correct? Thank you. Could I ask to all of you, and hello panel, what's been done to ensure the progression to senior positions within the brigade of women, staff from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and LGBTQ plus staff? I think you've addressed that slightly, but I'd like you to go into that a little bit more, please.
I think you've asked a very important question, because it's one thing to recruit people into an organisation. How they're then treated when they arrive and the opportunity they're given is equally important. I don't believe we are fully there yet. But what I would say is that the colleagues sitting next to me are looking very hard at the issue of opportunity, progression, ensuring processes to enable people to secure those opportunities are transparent and fair. And perhaps, Kate, you could speak to that, or Tim, depending on who would be more appropriate to answer. Because there is work being done in that environment, recognising we need to make improvements.
I can pick up certainly the outline of what we've been doing around that, because it's not unique to us, and we've looked at what other organisations are doing. So we're doing a lot of work with our employee support groups who represent the characteristics that you've just described there, in terms of understanding where there are blockages, where there are issues, and trying to encourage more people to throw their hat in the ring and to progress within the organisation, because we know there are some barriers there for people just wanting to be considered for progression and promotion. Kate and her team have done an awful lot of work around developing a new recruitment strategy that demonstrates much more fairness and transparency in how we make decisions around progression within the organisation. And we just very recently set out some very clear guidance for people, so they're really clear on what it is that's required if you want to take the step up, all the way from leading firefighter all the way up to assistant commissioner within the organisation. So there's really clear. And as part of that, one of the decisions that we took very recently within the organisation is that the equality and diversity elements of progression in terms of an assessment is kind of pass and fail, very much in the same way that we take incident command, to make sure that we're starting to develop that capability right across our leadership cadre within the organisation.
You referred to blockages. I wonder if you could go into that a little bit more and describe what some of those blockages might be.
So I think there's a perceived lack of fairness, there's a perceived lack of fairness around promotion opportunities within the London Fire Brigade. And we've known about that for some time, if we're honest. It's come through in staff, surveys that we've undertaken. It's come through in the conversations that we've had with employee support groups. And certainly when you look at our data in terms of progression and promotion, you will see that the numbers of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups and from women groups are less than the percentage of those employed. So there are clearly areas in there. We don't understand all of those areas. The culture review is part of what's trying to help us, I think, understand those more clearly. But a lot of it is around the perception of unfairness and therefore people not necessarily wanting to put themselves in a position where they're going to think about progressing their career within the organisation. And that's a real shame because we recognise that we've got 5,500 people within the London Fire Brigade and there's huge pools of talent there that potentially aren't putting themselves forward because they perceive unfairness. And we're doing everything that we can do to remove some of those myths and to create a really clear and transparent process for progression within the organisation.
You're talking about a perception of unfairness, and perceptions happen usually because there has been a situation or situations. So again, if you could just unpick that a little bit, what is the perception of unfairness? Could you give us examples?
Yeah, well, I think the data is really clear. When you look at the data, if you're from a Black, Asian and ethnic minority group, you are less likely to be promoted in the London Fire Brigade than if you are white. Similarly, if you are female, the data shows us that. It's not a huge disparity, but the disparity is there and it's been there for some time. Part of that will be some of the unconscious biases that assessors bring into the interview process, and we're looking and we're starting training around unconscious bias, making sure that everybody who is part of an assessment panel is trained on unconscious bias to remove some of those areas, because the data would suggest that it exists there.
With the unconscious bias training, as we know with training, it's not enough just to do it once. What have you got in terms of progressing that and making sure that people continuously are trained?
We're just rolling out now our performance and talent review process. So one of the things that both Andy and myself inherited when we came into our respective roles was a lack of opportunity for people to get trained in a systematic way. So we are now implementing a performance and talent review process that Kate and her team have developed to make sure that those conversations about development and training needs are an ongoing conversation and that we're far better equipped to deal with them than we have been previously.
So will there actually be a policy of continuous training for members of staff?
Within our recruitment strategy and policy that Kate has developed, there is absolutely clear in there that people need to be trained around unconscious bias, and that will be an ongoing requirement for them.
Thank you. So and you've referred to the issue around promotion. Want to know what targets, if any, do you have relating to the top earners in the brigade? And this is for you, Commissioner.
So I don't think we have defined targets at this point, but what I do know is that until we diversify, every level of leadership in the organisation, we will not be getting the benefit of the talent that Tim has referred to. We won't get the diversity of thought or decision making that will help us grow and improve as an organisation, and was so clearly criticised through both the inquiry and inspection processes. I think it's perhaps worth reflecting that since I took position, I've sought to diversify the decision-making kind of board level appointments. So we have 3 women directors, 2 male directors, and obviously myself. So we've sought to balance gender there, because I recognise, again, that normalises the workplace and I get the benefit of kind of more balanced decision-making. I think we need to do better at every level. I think the challenge around targets relates to the earlier question around targets as well from Assembly Member Sahota, and I think we should perhaps go away and look at that and set ourselves some more challenging kind of stretch targets to achieve. I would like to be transparent with this panel though, that I think we need to deal with more basic issues of culture and leadership first. So much of what you speak to, first of all, needs to be addressed in very large, face-to-face delivery of comprehensive leadership programs at every single level, to both challenge some of the beliefs and behaviours that are still inherent within parts of the brigade, And that in itself will open up, I think, some of the opportunities you quite rightly challenge us to demonstrate we are doing.
Thank you, Commissioner. My excuse me. My last question. I'll quote a statistic to you. Between 2017 and 2021, the number of Black, Asian and minority ethnic top earners in the LFB increased by 6 compared to 72 white members of staff. I think you'll agree with me that that is quite an appalling statistic. What I'd like to know, and I think again we have touched on this, but if we could re-emphasise and go into it a bit more, why are you promoting so few Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff to the top positions, and what are you doing to change that?
This is a result of historical legacy. So if you look at particularly the operational side of our organisation, and it speaks to the very basic recruitment questions that the Assembly member asked earlier, we are a predominantly white male organisation, and it takes quite a long time to achieve the correct level of competency to then kind of be promoted, particularly in the context of incident command and the operational duties. Until we change the base level pool of recruits to better reflect London, I'm afraid we are dealing with a legacy issue. That means we are pulling from a much smaller pool of Black, Asian colleagues in the context of that opportunity for promotion. So we need to change the base level. We need to do our very best to kind of build a more imaginative, perhaps less risk-averse approach to promotion as well. So actually accelerating people through those ranks if we can. We're looking at now, the challenge I've set both Tim and Kate is that I want to kind of move from the orthodoxies of promotion we have always held on to for generations, to recognise that talent sometimes lies at a lower level in the organisation, and therefore our effort should be in investing in that talent and seeing if we can accelerate their career. So that would be one example of what we're seeking to do. But I agree with you, that situation is unacceptable and actually speaks to, I think, a generational lack of investment in recognising the importance of really having a balanced workforce who give the best of what London has to offer.
Thank you, Chair.
You want to come in, Dr. Singh?
Yeah, I do, Chair. Thank you very much. Kate, just to come back to you. Since I've been sitting here, I'm just referring to, I've been told information that your corporate performance digest quarter 2021-2022 stated that your target for new recruits was 25% BME and 18% for female. Is that true?
I believe that is true. I don't know if that... I don't want to confirm that that's our current target, because as the Commissioner says, we want to go away and have a look at targets.
So given that this could be true, why is it less than 40% for the MPS? Why are you not being more ambitious?
I think that's a very good question.
I think if I can come in there, they are legacy data from our London safety plan. So all of the targets that you will see in front of you that our performance digest reports against at the moment will have been equality targets that were set probably 4 or 5 years ago now at the outset of our London safety plan. The opportunity for us as we start to develop our new plan, which will be our community risk management plan, is to have a look at the targets that we want to put in place across the organisation around workforce representation. And I think you're right, we can be far more ambitious than that, because if you take those targets, they're much lower, but we are exceeding them, and we're exceeding them quite significantly. For the first time ever, we are achieving our London safety plan targets for staff representation across the organisation.
Could I perhaps just come in on this? Let me give you an assurance that the whole of kind of this panel, that those targets will shift. But what we can't do at this point is put our feet down on it, because it would be to undermine the consultation process, it would be to undermine the development of that plan. But from my perspective as Commissioner, I cannot see any other option than to shift those targets. And I'll be extremely surprised if we don't do so in the new iteration of the plan.
Well, I hope you'll write to the Chair and to tell us what your new targets are, because I think this 25% and 18% are miserably low. And secondly, there are no targets for the LGBTQ plus community. Can we have targets for that also, please?
Of course. Dr. Sahota, I think my view on this is I can look across London and I can see the percentages of different communities that make up London. Our aspiration should simply be to mirror that. So our targets should be set to mirror the population of London, and that's what we should aspire to. And if we have to come back in front of the committee to explain why we have not been able to achieve that, then so be it. That doesn't mean we should not set ourselves that aspiration. I believe your point is well made, and we should hear it.
Good. Thank you much.
Thank you. Commissioner, I don't know who to address this to, but I'm happy to take the answer from any of you. Have any of you looked into why so many women leave the service? And what actions are you taking to see if you can stop that? But are you aware of why? Who's going to answer that?
I think Kate would probably be best placed to answer it in the detail. I suppose what I would reflect on is that there is an issue around retention. My instinct tells me it's about everything from how we support people when perhaps they have children, to some of the issues that were raised by your colleague here on the panel around opportunity. There will certainly be something in there around the culture. I think this is, again, partly why we need to do such a broad cultural review alongside some of the other kind of people strategy focused interventions we're making. But perhaps you could talk about
the trouble is instincts that aren't always the answer. So what do we actually do? Do we interview them properly when they leave to ask why they are leaving?
Do, yes. So there's a leavers survey for everybody that leaves the organisation, and they're offered an interview, and some of them don't take up that opportunity. And we do look at the themes that come out of that. And they are some of the things that Commissioner has referred to in some circumstances, although the numbers are quite small. So I don't want to kind of say that there is one reason why people leave. But certainly some of it is around our access to flexible working. The shift patterns that our operational staff have make it very difficult, if I'm honest, for people to manage families. We also know that there is evidence of a lack of sense of belonging in some circumstances. So we know from our staff survey that, only about 50% of our staff feel that they do belong in the organisation. And that's something that we have been really focusing on since that, and that's where that bore out our togetherness strategy. And I think from the anecdotal evidence we get from that, sometimes women don't perhaps feel as much as they belong as our male colleagues. That's partly because the number of them is very small, and also it may be to do with progression, because we have very few numbers of women at senior levels, unfortunately, which is something that we're really trying to change. And if people are looking up and trying to progress, they feel that they cannot be what they can't see, and that's something that we need to change as well. There are other kind of systematic challenges that we know, and procedural challenges that we know are challenges for women. For example, sometimes access to PPE, access to appropriate facilities at fire stations, which is other areas that we're really focusing attention on through our togetherness strategy, so our procurement processes and also our programme of work on fire stations to ensure privacy for all and to ensure that there aren't those kind of institutional barriers for women to feel like they belong in the fire brigade.
Absolutely, and the culture review will be vital.
Exactly.
And Chair, perhaps we could assure you that knowing that people obviously have a choice as to whether or not they speak to us at the point of exit, both myself, Tim and Kate are proactively, along with other senior leaders in the organisation, seeking to engage with as many different groups of staff within the LFB as we can. So, for example, I sat and spoke to 60 women operational staff the other day. Really, they reflected exactly what Kate has said back to me around how they felt when they were treated when pregnant, issues around privacy, the wider culture, opportunity. So we are seeking the answers. I think the challenge for us is how we drive positive cultural change across so many different aspects, and that's partly what culture review is about.
Yeah, the trouble is if you don't get the answers, you can't fix it, so you'll never get anywhere. Okay, the last questions in this tiny section are from my colleague, Hina Bakar.
Thank you, Chair. This has been covered already before about the training. You mentioned things like unconscious bias training, etc. Is there anything that you'd like to add to the training that you've provided, particularly on the issues facing women, staff from BAME backgrounds and the LGBT staff?
So I think you can talk about culture in theory. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if you do not deliver proper training out to the thousands of staff that the London Fire Brigade embodies, then actually it's just talk. So we are delivering a very large-scale face-to-face leadership training programme to every single part of the organisation at every level. That will incorporate matters of inclusion and culture. It focuses very heavily on the behaviours we've set out that we expect from our staff, centred on compassion, togetherness and accountability. Sitting behind that, we are running another set of training interventions and workshops that focus on culture and behaviours specifically, and I expect that again to hit every corner of the organisation, and much as the other Assembly members' question, that's not a one hit. One of the things we've learnt in other areas of business from the Grenfell inquiry is that the LFB has a history of delivering big, spectacular kind of programmes of training and then stops. It is my view that this stuff never stops. It is a professional discipline that sits alongside incident command, for example.
So are you saying it's compulsory then, this training?
Yes.
Yeah, so
it's
all the time and refreshed.
And it's continuous because it is part of our professional practice. Leadership, inclusion, command and operational competency sit at the same level for me in terms of requirements in the organisation, because each one of them is inextricably linked. The ability to deliver our service properly to what is one of the most complex and diverse cities in the world means you cannot separate those things out, and it has been a very serious error in the past of the London Fire Brigade to do so.
You've talked a lot about culture and also the myths that you're trying to dispel about the fire brigade, working as a firefighter. I'm a primary school teacher in training, and when I was working, I did career workshops and brought in fire engines and people, the kids would get on and it was lots of fun. But that was me pushing that, as a primary school teacher, inviting the fire services to come in and talk about the job. We encouraged women and we encouraged ethnic minorities to come in and talk about the role. What are you doing to make sure that this is happening in schools, rather than the schools approaching you? Are you going to the schools yourself?
So we've got a full-time, fully established schools team that goes out professionally to schools, and we'll have to write to you with the volume of school visits, but we do a huge number of school visits. But I think a really well-made point you've just addressed to me is something that we're focusing on as a strategic priority. So we have 4 strategic priorities. The best people, best place to work, facing the future, which let's be honest means continuous improvement, outward-facing and operational excellence. The outward-facing bit is the piece you refer to, which is not waiting to be asked, making sure our fire stations are genuinely open, that we reach proactively into communities, and it must be one of the priorities we really improve on and deliver through the next CRMP. It's one of the questions we are really interested in hearing from communities about. What do you want from our service? You've just spoken to me there as a member of London's communities, as a primary school teacher. You just told me what you want, which is your local fire station being more proactive in their approach to you. That is an entirely reasonable ask, and one we should hear. We shouldn't just rely on the answer that we've got a professional schools team, the very large numbers of visits we already do. We should seek to improve. So I think your challenge is well made.
I'd love to get a bit of feedback from you about the schools that you've approached and how you've been working with them, and also the response that you get back. How are the children responding back to you, and whether it makes any real difference? It would be great to see.
I think it does, because we have a very highly focused kind of approach to schools engagement, focusing actually in areas of greatest need, deprivation, where there's likely to be the greatest risk, and we by proxy pass messages through children to their parents particularly, and we also find it's a really useful vehicle for both recruitment into cadets and then later into the workforce itself. But I think whilst that I think is a very impressive programme, and I think lots of fire stations do really good work locally with schools, I think we can improve our offer. I think Brilliant. It's something about how stations, sitting at the heart of their communities, really understand what the school communities, the health communities are around them, and are proactively making their offer into those spaces in a more consistent way.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Mahim, you wanted to come in on retention, did you, and recruitment?
It was just to follow up on a comment that the Commissioner made about culture, but off the back in relation to retention.
Okay, that's fine, but we're coming into culture section next.
I could wait until the next section, that's fine.
Are you happy to do that?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll make sure I bring you in, but put your hand up when you think it's the appropriate time for your specific question. Okay, we're going on to the culture review now, everyone, so we'll start off with Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank
Commissioner, we've discussed this before, but cultural change can take years to come into effect in an organisation. So, what short-term objectives have the Brigade put in place to improve behaviours and attitude of staff?
I think that's a fair challenge. So we can't wait for culture review. That would be a mistake. So I think some of the things I've already talked about, for example, the leadership training delivery programme that started now, the culture workshops which focus on behaviour and creating a safe and dignified workplace that have started now, you know, in respect to areas of particular vulnerability, for example, around trainees, the very comprehensive action plan following the tragic death of Jade and Francois Esprit that, you know, we have been working on from the moment it was published. So that's an example of process and cultural change happening now. So I think we are challenging ourselves through our people strategy to make the difference now. And I would like to make the point that when I took this post in January 2020, we did not have a people strategy. We did not have a board that referred to matters of our people. You know, since then, we have created those governance structures which are kind of under the skin of the organisation, but are equally important to holding ourselves to account. You know, by having an independent audit committee that will look at those matters as well, by bringing in external participants from the community into our board, we are doing the things that mean we are making a difference now, not just waiting for culture review. I see it as a continuous process that will never come to the end of, you know, successive commissioners down the line. Your culture, and particularly your culture of leadership and inclusion, is something that good organisations pay attention to and drive change in all the time.
Thank you. And on the subject of culture, the LFB have defined or described their existing culture and the ideal culture. And the existing culture is adjectives like target-driven, structured, demanding, control and accomplishment-driven. And the ideal culture is supportive, open, dynamic, innovative, and that sort of thing. Now, much of the core business of what you do is incident management, which is a command and control environment. And I know personally from being involved in incident management for 10 years in the railway that it is often that command and control, that incident management environment is often target driven. It is control and accomplishment driven because you've got lives at stake. So how is the cultural review going to kind of square that circle? How are you going? Because you're going to need an element of both in the brigade. How are you going to draw those two things together?
I think it's an excellent question. We've thought about this, and the kind of blended approach is embodied in our incident command strategy. You'll see that our incident command strategy talks of the people factors in operational leadership. So I actually think we're quite good at process-driven command and control. Notwithstanding some of the challenges placed to us by the Grenfell Tower inquiry, actually our track record in London shows us we're pretty good at command and control. What we've paid less attention to is the human aspects of operational leadership. And actually, if you go back to that inquiry and look at where much of the criticism lies, it lies not about our understanding of policy procedures, ability to give a command, but nuanced decision-making in the context of no policy, genuine operational leadership. I've been an operational leader my whole career, as a British Army officer in some of the most desperate situations you can imagine, and then into some of the largest incidents in London. My personal experience is it is the human factor of operational leadership that really counts when things get difficult, because sometimes policy and procedure does not fit. So I think our approach in what I think is an excellent new incident command strategy is to take the two. And culture review will have to look at aspects of operational leadership, because I think some of the inertia in decision making that we have been criticised for in the inquiry actually came from the lack of humanity in our wider culture potentially, the fear of making a decision, the sense that you would be punished for having the confidence in an empowered way to do something outside of policy. These are very serious questions, and you are right to challenge us on it. But my assurance is that we are considering them in exactly that way, how the two things fit together.
Thank you. And moving on to my next question. Again, this is something that I've challenged on before in this meeting and in our previous discussions. But what action is the LFB taking to address the needs and issues of existing LGBT staff at all levels in the brigade?
I can speak to the highest level stuff, which is ensuring that we really support our equality and support groups, that we're very public in our support for colleagues in the LGBT plus community. So, for example, we had a Pride celebration at Euston where we brought in external participants, did a really sort of well-received kind of fashion show. But we need to move beyond what some people might view as the tokenistic, and we need to embed really an understanding of what it means to be LGBT plus and work in the London Fire Brigade in our kind of programme of leadership delivery in terms of some very specific issues around people's sexuality in the culture workshops we're addressing, use of language. Those are the things that immediately come to mind. They are built into those delivery programmes, they are built into our strategy. We discuss them at our people board in the context of governance. Tim or Kate, is there anything useful you could add to that in the detail?
I think you've kind of answered it, Andy, but you know, we have a very good proactive chair of our equality support group around LGBTQ+, and Natalie's done a lot of work both at our togetherness board in terms of talking around the specific needs of the members that she represents. We've also done work with our heads of service, which are our senior leaders within the organisation, about demonstrating change. If you think about the performance and talent process that I talked about earlier, every member of staff has to have an equality objective, and we'll just start to pull those together now as we roll that entire process out. And I think there'll be an abundance of evidence there about people actively looking at all elements of our culture, but in particularly, you know, the LGBTQ+ elements. And it's a really proactive and really good employee support group that we're really proud to support, actually.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Polensky.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, panel. Commissioner, I just want to follow off the back of that question. The last time we were met, I was really struck by your commitment to the LGBTIQA community, and actually we talked about the bullying allegations within the Fire Brigade, and you spoke very eloquently and very strongly against it and made a real commitment to change that, so thank you for that. There's a specific issue that I'm in that community as a gay man, but actually trans people in particular have a whole new set of issues and actually are frequently under attack in the general society and the community. Is there any work you're doing specifically to protect trans people within the London Fire Brigade?
So we employ trans people. We have seen them sometimes take a difficult journey in that regard within the organisation. So yes, we are thinking in a very focused way about it in all aspects, from the facilities that are provided on fire stations in the context of privacy for all, in terms of, again, the language that is used and specific support, actually, because it's such a particularly challenging journey for an individual to take. So ensuring that people are placed in the right position in the workforce, that we have individual managers who are well briefed to support them on that journey and support them once they are openly trans within our workforce. So yes, it is something we address specifically, and we will continue to have to kind of focus on, I think, as one particular aspect of equality, because it is particularly challenging with a wide range of views around the subject.
Thank you. Now, I accept you weren't in place till January 2020. I don't want to play a blame game about whoever came before you, but why wasn't action taken sooner on all of these issues, and why was the Fire Brigade not working to be more inclusive earlier?
I can't speak for what happened before, really. I'm not sure it's my position to do so. I can only really tell you what we intend to do to drive positive change. But the one thing I would reflect on is I think that the London Fire Brigade and the National Fire Service generally were an industry that were not inspected, were by default not regulated for generations, nearly 20 years. And I think it is that lack of external scrutiny brought to bear with a real regulatory edge that enabled us perhaps to become stagnant in all sorts of places, because I can look across almost every area of our business and recognise we need to drive very significant change. And I don't think inclusion or culture is any different from training, our operational delivery. I think if I look across every area of business, despite the very real efforts of colleagues within the GLA to scrutinise us effectively, we suffered from the lack of inspection and being truly held to account with that kind of regulatory edge. And I think the roots of it lie very much in that.
Yeah, I think the committee would generally agree that scrutiny is important, so it's good to hear you recognise that. Just finally, what work has been done to ensure the views of staff are reflected in the culture review?
So I think we've talked already to the very sort of wide engagement we've made around the design of that culture review. So obviously we've gone out to representative bodies, all the relevant unions, and they've had very strong views on it. We've talked to staff through focus groups and through line management to explain what we're doing and how the form it might take. I think one of the first roles for the chair when they come in will be to take that early work and seek a wider process of engagement, because they in a way have control over the breadth of the kind of terms of reference as they land. Part of one of the first things I think that will fall out of culture review, and we've delayed it for expressly that purpose, is a full workforce survey. And perhaps Tim, you could speak to that, because we've held it, haven't we? For exactly this reason.
We haven't done a full survey of our workforce as the London Fire Brigade since 2018. We've had other surveys since then, particularly, but they've been managed through our inspectorate when they've come in, either doing a full inspection or when they looked at us in relation to the COVID pandemic. So we have some data from that. We're ready to go with the staff survey, and Kate and her team have done some fantastic work around that, and I think we're just signing the questions off this week, or tomorrow, aren't we, Kate, at People Board? But our representative bodies have asked if we could just hold doing it until the culture review chair is appointed. They're nervous about us doing it now and almost influencing that chair's view before they are appointed, which we understand. But once the chair is appointed, it will be up to them to determine the timeliness of us going out and doing a full survey of our workforce around how it feels to work within the London Fire Brigade. And that will give us some really rich data in which we can develop the culture review further going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Mima.
Chair, I just wanted to pick up on something that you had mentioned. You've mentioned a few times the culture and leadership needs to change, and I appreciate that's quite a nebulous thing to change and kind of pin down. But I wonder if, maybe digging a little bit deeper, if you have considered what are the specific areas of that culture you want to change. I mean, some people might consider the fire brigade to be a little bit macho, like you've said yourself, overwhelmingly white and male. Within that, you know, we'll wonder about the difficulties, particularly women who might already be on your staff, might face in terms of progression, similarly with Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. And as Assembly Member Rogers has also mentioned, LGBTQ staff. I just wonder, you know, things like, do people get promoted just by virtue of sticking around for 20 years? Or do they get promoted by, as you've talked about, trying to identify competence and ability? How are you going to measure those things, given that at the beginning it was a bit difficult to pin down what the actual numerical targets were?
Yeah. So I think actually we run fairly challenging and competitive promotion processes. I think there is a question of unconscious bias, and perhaps more subtle than that, the understanding of assessors around the value that difference can bring as well. So as you've heard, we're formalising the diversity and inclusion piece within some very challenging exercises within those promotion processes now. So in the same way we put people through an incident command exercise, we're now going to put them through a really challenging ED&I exercise. And that's different from the past. In the past, we just asked you a question, and obviously it was like, you know, if the assessor has the same bias as the person they're interviewing, then who's to judge on the answer to the question? So actually, we've brought in some external expertise to kind of design that exercise. We will pick very carefully the people who are assessing. So that's one example of, you know, concretely changing an assessment process to reflect those concerns. But at a more basic level, in the context of everyone who works in the brigade, regardless of gender, faith, sexuality, or nationality, or ethnic background, we're focusing on key behaviours. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you work for London Fire Brigade, you need to turn up correct to work. And by correct, I mean that you treat your fellow employee with compassion. You use that compassion to drive team working, togetherness, and you hold yourself accountable for your own behaviours. Now, when you state behaviours like that, they can, like you say, they can sound quite nebulous. They are not. They are real things. And where we can point to examples of where that's not happening, those values are built into the performance management framework that Kate and Tim have brought through, and we will hold people to account to those. That, again, is not something, and I know it might sound extraordinary to the Assembly, that has happened before. We have never had a value-based performance management system, and we're talking very basic building blocks here. But that, I think, is one of the primary drivers for change, which is to say, actually don't focus on protected characteristics, because we quite often get it thrown back that there's a singular focus on that. My focus is, yes, on ensuring equality of opportunity through the lens of protected characteristics, but in a much more basic level, just making the point that we all need to act decently to each other and driving that cultural change through that performance management piece, and by explaining to people in a very basic way through the leadership programme what it means to behave that way, because we're not taking any of this for granted.
Just to follow up on that, Chair, quickly. So you've talked about the accountability of people in the brigade, irrespective of where they are and which level. I wonder what maybe specific lessons that might be drawn from the experience of the Met around what is that accountability, and, you know, should you get to a point where that behaviour is not acceptable, how are you going to avoid kind of a closing of ranks and resist going back to that culture where issues are not addressed and they sort of escalate?
I think that's an excellent challenge. I think we're already at that point. So one of the things we've seen from the announcement of the culture review is actually staff are beginning to feel safer, and that's backed up by the Safe to Speak scheme that is launching now, which is based on the NHS model, an anonymised place where staff can feel safe to make complaint. The volume of complaint I've seen come into my office alone shows me we have pockets of poor culture in the organisation. And those complaints are specific and involve people in leadership positions sometimes. What I can assure this committee is that we are taking robust performance management action with those individuals. And where we see, perhaps historically, there has been a closing of the ranks because some of those complaints have been heard and have been judged to be finished before, we are simply reopening them, and we are placing different leaders in place of leading through those processes who we know will not fall into that category of closing the ranks. But what I would say is there is no single answer to this. This has to happen at a number of levels. We have to change the base level culture, which, like Mr. Rogers has said, will take years. We have to focus on very clear interventions around leadership and behaviours delivered to everyone. And then we have to hold individuals to very strong account for examples of poor behaviour. And where we don't see the outcome that is transparent or is balanced against what has actually happened, then we will go back to it. And I think it is only by showing your commitment as a leader from the top of the organisation and holding other senior leaders to account that we'll start to see the shift. But again, my assurance to this committee is that is what is happening inside the London Fire Brigade, however painful that is for colleagues who perhaps don't appreciate it, and we will continue to press on in that vein.
Okay. Fine. Assembly Member Prince, I think one of yours has been asked, but if you'd like to go with the other
answered anyway. Yeah. Thank you. Commissioner, do we have or do you have a target date for the appointment of the cultural chair?
I'm going to have to refer to my notes. So we're nearly at the end of it. So it's October, isn't it? So we're a long way through. We're doing the long sift now, and we'll be into the short sift of the process imminently. Again, I suppose there's a bit of detail to give this committee. Whilst I can't talk to the individuals involved, it'd be to undermine the process. What we've seen is very significant national figures showing an interest in chairing that, which again I think speaks to the credibility of the process and the seriousness of it.
Are you saying probably by the end of October? Is that what you're saying?
We would expect to have the chair appointed by the end of October. That's what we're saying in all of our conversations we're having in documentation, and then at that point the review will start.
And how many days do you think? How many days are you proposing for this chair to be working?
So I think it will depend on the chair to some extent. The remuneration level is set, so that won't change. And I think it will depend on the chair themselves. They will have other things that they're doing outside of London Fire Brigade, of course. But I would imagine as they get into the process, it will be a fairly significant amount of their time that they'll need to spend in the brigade, working with a panel of people that they will want to appoint beneath them to help them do all of the work. And then obviously we would envisage at the moment that the review would take up to a year to its conclusion. There'll be a lot of time there in terms of writing the final report and making sure that that report enables us to deliver, the change that, Commissioner Rowe has already described very clearly that he aspires to deliver.
You mentioned the remuneration. What figure is that?
Between 24 and 30,000.
Between 24 and 30. And is that like job and finish, is it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Following the death of 21-year-old firefighter Jaden Francois Esprit, you did mention him earlier, what actions have the London Fire Brigade implemented to prevent future suicides amongst the staff?
So I sat with Jaden's family 6 weeks after his death and listened really to their very strongly held views that his employment in the London Fire Brigade was a major contributory factor to that awful decision and the tragic loss of life. I immediately initiated a major investigation, which has resulted in a very robust action plan with 32 actions on it. We are working, we are a long way through that. So that involves everything from changing the transfer policy to immediate interim measures like calling every single trainee in the organisation from outside of the line management chain to check they were all right and to get an understanding of their experience, bringing together large groups of trainees that Tim and I personally have spoken to, again in an environment of confidence, to understand their experiences. Systemic changes to the way we do learning support, for example, support to those who are neurodivergent, including expanding that team. I've just signed the papers off on that. So a range of examples across process, across making sure immediately we went back into those most vulnerable in the context of trainees to check how they were. And taking focused action where we could see there was individual vulnerability. In the context of suicide itself, suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 49. If you look at the demographic of our workforce and the level of trauma some people within our workforce are exposed to, that becomes an extrapolating factor. So we know that along with the military and policing and health in particular, we face a real challenge around the kind of threat of suicide. Particularly to male colleagues. So we have a strategic lead in that regard, which is Richard Mills, my deputy. He is focused on delivering a programme of direct intervention around suicide prevention, and that's everything from internal communication to focusing our psychological health offer where it is going to make the greatest impact. Perhaps you can expand further, Tim or Kate, because I know both of you have been heavily involved in that. Again, I wouldn't know which one of you would be best placed. Kate?
Yeah, I can expand on the support we're giving to suicide prevention, and as the Commissioner said, this is a real area of focus for us. So we've got a range of services to support the mental health of our staff. We've got our in-house counselling and trauma service. We've got our 40 trained mental health first aiders as well, and that is being expanded and rolled out further. We've also got a mandatory online mental health awareness course that we're rolling out as well, and a specific stress, anxiety and depression course for our managers. But also we're doing some research with an external organisation looking at kind of suicide in firefighters generally, because this isn't something that's unique to London Fire Brigade. This is something that is potentially an issue across the fire service. And we're also looking at specific, and this is nearly complete, a specific mental health policy, which will really help, I think, to embed our support to our staff around mental health into the organisation and make it very clear what the responsibilities are for managers and for every other aspect of the brigade. I'm happy to expand further.
Okay, no. How many sad deaths have there, or suicides have there been since we lost Jaden in the brigade?
Since we lost Jaden, we have had one suicide.
One. Okay, one too many, which is, I know, you would all agree. Can you give me an update on the progress of the list of actions given by Coroner Hassel following the death of Jaden?
Yep, so perhaps you could do that, Kate, please, both in respect of our action plan, which the coroner accepted, and then the additional items, which included stuff around culture.
Yes, that's fine. So we had 32 actions. They were made up of our 24 internal recommendations and additional preventing future deaths recommendations, or recommendations we set on the back of the report from the coroner. 15 of those are complete. 8 of them are on track. There are a couple that are off track. Some of those are in relation to the work we're doing on our transfer policy, but we just this morning had a meeting where we pulled everybody together to get a plan in place for putting those back on track. So we are making really good progress, and I think some of those actions that have closed will make a really big difference. That includes looking at, as the Commissioner mentioned, our approach to learning support, our approach to our recruitment process, and our approach to the mental health support that we give to our staff and particularly to our trainees. As I mentioned before, that focus that we're really giving to supporting mental health and preventing future suicides.
Okay, you did say it was the transfer policy that's not on course. The transfer policy gives an extreme amount of problems, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Well, the transfer policy, it's a complex area.
I know.
But that's why it is really important to us. And so we absolutely committing, we're doing an update to our people board tomorrow on what is happening with the transfer actions and specifically the transfer policy and station allocation policy. We have somebody dedicated to work on the development of a new policy following the equality impact assessments that were carried out on both policies recently. And we are progressing that quickly.
Could I just come in, Chair, just to provide some reassurance that changing the policy in its totality to ensure we both support workforce planning but also address this vulnerability around the kind of mental health and experience of trainees, that may well be a longer term complex bit of work, but in the interim we're not taking action. So for example, I know as Commissioner there are 45 trainees currently on the transfer list. Every single one of those trainees has been contacted individually from outside the line management chain to explore why they're on the transfer list, the reasons that they might have made that request. Now, that approach will be systemised in the end in order to address that vulnerability. But what we are doing, as we make both the kind of IT system and policy changes, is just making sure that we track what trainees are on that transfer list and we go out to them as individuals, knowing we've got to make that deeper and more sustainable policy and system change.
Okay, and are you identifying if there are problems on a specific watch or on a specific area? And so are you going to go in hard and deal with that?
We are, as a result of that contact with those FFDs, if anything of concern comes out through that conversation, we will absolutely take forward the necessary action.
Has it come out as a concern?
I don't want to go into detail about specifics, but I'm happy outside of this meeting to look at what I can share with the group about.
I'd be very happy to have a meeting about that. This has been an issue for as long as I've been involved with the Brigade, which is over a decade. If those issues aren't resolved, then we're going to continue to be talking about issues on different watches and with various members of staff. I'll leave it there because I don't want people to be mentioned, but nevertheless, this has got to be dealt with, doesn't it? Assembly member Polanski.
Covered it, Chair. It was about transfers.
It was
about transfers, so you've covered it.
Oh, well, without even knowing, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Okay, we're now going on to promoting inclusion within the LFB, and I think it's starting with Assembly Member Bahali.
Thank you. So we're going to be talking about the togetherness strategy, and we'd like to know a little bit more about the progress that you've made and also some of the challenges.
So I think where I'd start, and then I am going to hand over to Tim or Kate, is just to make the point again that before I took over in January 2020, there was not a strategy for people. That is what the togetherness strategy is. So it encompasses everything from the training we give people around leadership and inclusion, which obviously has made great progress because we are delivering those programs. Those programs were not in place before we took over. You know, it focuses on everything from that to matters of equality support groups, to actually the way we engage in communities as well. So if we look at not only inclusion and diversity through the lens of what's happening internally, but perhaps more importantly, what we're doing to serve London, we have piloted a completely different approach to community engagement. You know, 9 pilot boroughs where we're taking very swift action in response to community concerns. So for example, after the New Providence Wharf fire, the sort of events that we ran there, we have never done before. We went in and sat in difficult public forums, and the benefit, you know, that we've received from that has been overwhelmingly positive. If we talk about our approach to the Grenfell community, not only I, but our new dedicated community engagement team meets with that community regularly now, regularly with bereaved and survivors, to hear their challenge. That's a completely different approach that, again, is framed in some way by the togetherness strategy. Perhaps, Tim, you could speak to other items of delivery that are falling from that board.
I mean, I think, you've explained it well there, Andy, in terms of we inherited, an inclusion programme called Safer Together, which was a very long list of actions that fell out of the previous London Safety Plan, which wasn't really addressing some of the issues and challenges that we were hearing from our workforce. At the same time, we didn't really have any capacity or capability in the organisation to start developing inclusion. So there was lots to kind of rebuild in that basis. We now have, a very strong equality and inclusion team. I can hear Kate in my ear now saying, yes, but it needs to be bigger and needs to be more, Tim, and that's fair. We have a togetherness strategy now that sets out, the direction of travel that we are taking as an organisation, not just internally within the organisation, but also across our communities. We have a togetherness board, so we have a very specific piece of governance which Commissioner Rowe chairs.
Tell me a little bit more about the togetherness board and how many people are on that.
Yeah. So the togetherness board is made up of Commissioner Rowe chairs it. It's made up of the directors and a number of heads of service within the organisation. I think there's about 12 internal members, but I might be slightly missing one or two within that. But we also have, very importantly, 3 external members appointed onto the board to bring in external knowledge, expertise and scrutiny and challenge to us in terms of how that board operates. And that oversees the progress that we're making around the strategy. And in terms of some of the areas we've done, we've talked about employee support groups already, and there's a lot of work through the strategy around working with our employee groups to develop further strategies and policies that support work groups. And we've seen through that work, we've seen some additional equality support groups start to emerge. So a carers support group, a Christianity support group, and so forth. We've also taken a much stronger approach in the way that we do equality impact assessments, not just in the context of making sure that we are compliant with the Equality Act, but also making sure that we really do have due regard to equality issues at every decision that the London Fire Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor need to make within the organisation.
What about the Togetherness Representative Committee that you've also got as well?
Yes, so we have a representative committee now, which brings, because obviously with lots of employee support groups around the organisation, it's been really effective to bring them all into one place, actually into one group, along with our representative bodies, our trade unions. So there is one forum speaking on behalf of our workforce. That's fairly new in its creation, but it's already starting to reap really good benefits. And some of the stuff that we talked around our recruitment strategy has been really usefully informed by that group.
There's lots of great stuff happening and starting, but what are the challenges? What have you found difficult? What's proving to be not so easy at the moment?
So I think at the as ever, strategies are nothing more than strategies unless people see them working on the ground. And I think across our workforce of 5,500 people, not everybody is feeling that change is being made in the right areas and quickly enough. There are other parts, just being candid, there are other parts of the organisation who don't recognise the need for a togetherness strategy. I go out, as I know Kate does and Commissioner Rowe does, to fire stations and watches a lot of the time, and we talk about togetherness, and they say, that already happens here. We don't need a strategy for you to tell us how to work each other and support each other. And to some extent, they're right, because I often go into watches and you see togetherness, an absolute embodiment of togetherness in terms of the way those watches interact with each other. But I'm also not naive enough to think that there might not be a quiet member of that watch who can't be their true authentic self every day when they come to work. We've already referenced Jaden, and there was an example of an individual who struggled and wasn't listened.
I'll be visiting Tooting Fire Station tomorrow, so I'll ask them how they.
So ask them about the togetherness strategy. It'd be really interesting to see what they say.
I'll let you know. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assembly Member Rogers.
Chair. Tim, I think you've almost answered this question, but talking about equality support groups, and you've identified some new ones you'd like to set up. You mentioned carers and Christianity. Are there other examples that you've got of groups you want to
They're the two new ones. I'm in my head I'm thinking there might be a third one, Kate, but you might be able to help me out here.
Neurodiversity.
And of course, neurodiversity, of course. How could I forget neurodiversity, given I've literally done the pilot training for that yesterday. So neurodiversity as well, and we've already talked about that in the context of a number of areas in terms of the importance of that group. So and that's something we want to continue, growing, because there are lots of, and again, I think it's an example where we're not just bound by the Equality Act and protected characteristics. There are lots of groups of people outside of the Equality Act that need to have a voice in the organisation and need to be listened to.
Thank you. My final question, I think this is probably for you, Commissioner. You've spoken a lot about what you're doing around diversity, inclusion and togetherness, and I personally appreciate your candidness about what the scale of the challenge that you face. But what more do you think that the Brigade needs to do, other than maybe the things you've already talked about, to ensure that diversity, inclusion, togetherness is fully embedded in the organisation?
I think the answer doesn't lie with me. I think it's about our ability to listen. So I'll give you an example. The football game that England lost in the final. Obviously, we saw, real endeavour by that team and young men putting themselves forward under a very high-pressured situation, only to receive the most appalling racist abuse. That caused great consternation across many of our staff groups. What was interesting to me was that the support we've given our equality support groups meant they felt empowered to come proactively together, find space in my diary, force a meeting in my diary alongside the directorial team to confront us with what they felt was an inadequate response in terms of our internal and external communication, particularly for black staff. I think they were right to challenge us. I don't think we got it right. But it gives you an example of how we're learning to listen, because I'm not sure I've got all the answers. I know the basics. I know I've got to drive better change in behaviours. I know I've got to deliver in the most basic way good leadership programmes, good programmes of training around inclusion. I know I've got to continue to support long-serving members of staff who might also feel excluded by this process. So trying to find that balance is, I think, as much about listening. So I think the answers will unfold from the structures and the governance we put in place, but particularly our ability to hear our staff tell us how it's going. Your sense check at Tooting is my sense check. So what I've said to the directors is all of this stuff is nice. What I say to the committee, that's great. But what I need is when one of you, on one of your visits, steps onto a fire station, you hear a firefighter, or you go to one of our inspecting teams, you hear an inspecting officer tell you what has happened in their lives as a result of that strategy. Otherwise, it is meaningless. And the same goes for the inspectorate. When the inspectorate step onto what will be one of 50 fire stations they visit in January, the only measure of my success, of the success of our leadership team, is not the strategy I brief to them, but what that firefighter says to them. And I think that is where we find our answers, in our firefighters, in our control room, in our inspecting staff, in our IT support teams. So I think I can't give you one, because I think we need to continuously ask the question and evolve. And this journey never ends. I mean, one of the first things you ever said to me, Tim, was that you never get to the end of this rainbow, Andy. This is it. You just keep going and going and going, because there is always something to learn, and there is always something to change, and there is always something to improve.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I've just got a couple of questions. I'll make them quick, because we'll all freeze to death, I think, in this wretched chamber. How many staff of the Fire Brigade actually got working on diversity as their job?
That's a good question, Kate. Can you add it up, and if we include secondments? We may have to write to you with this one, but we'll have a go now.
So I believe it's 3 to 4, but I would like to write to you specifically to confirm.
If you could do that. How many complaints do you currently have against the Fire Brigade from BAME, male and female staff?
Again, the total's shifting, so could we write to you with those details? What I would say as well, when we include the numbers of staff working specifically on D&I, we need to include the work that Jane's doing out in the areas, because you've got dedicated officers, you've got a team of 15, we've got a 15-strong team of people pulled together to deliver cultural workshops, for example, who are doing formal strategy. So I think we've got a bigger number than the small central policy team, but we will write to you with the detail, and the complaints will be utterly transparent. We will just pull that data together, because I couldn't give you an answer.
And just one more. Have you received any complaints of harassment by females external to the LFB? As an example, anybody from the LAS when we're working?
I don't believe we have, but again, we'll go and look, and we will write to you to confirm whether or not we have.
Very grateful, thank you. I'm not seeing anybody else with any questions. So I'll say a very big thank you to you all. Thank you for your contributions today. Colleagues, can we note the report in today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussions? Can we note the committee work programme and meeting dates?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Thursday the 21st of October at 10 o'clock in the chamber in City Hall. And I have no other urgent business. I therefore declare this meeting to be closed.
Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
5 seconds.
We're staying for the... Who is staying for the...
Informal session, members, and obviously we have our guests for the